Hello, Year 10. Okay, so today's lesson, I want to look at this idea of why did the USSR invade Afghanistan in 1979? Why is it that we end up with the Cold War starting again at this period? So, before we go any further, just a bit of a recap. First of all, equipment check. Can you make sure, please, that you have got the attached worksheet on Google Docs? Make sure you've got that to fill in at different points during this lesson. And if there's anything that I've not made clear, I've attached a revision guide as well to your Google Classroom. If you look at page 30, that should help clear that up as well. So you want those two things. So, starting task. Can you just give these two questions a go, please? So, from 1963 to 1979, both the USA and USSR, they've been trying to build better relations with each other in a period of peace. Two quick recap questions. First of all, what event had nearly led to a nuclear war in the 1960s, and in which year did that happen? And also, what was the terminological name given to this period of peace? Let's call it a period of peace. It's actually got a weird little name. What is that? So just pause the video, give those two questions a go for me, please. Okay. So hopefully you worked out that the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 had nearly led to this nuclear war, and it made both sides realise they had to work harder for peace. And hopefully you remembered this name for this period of peace was given the name détente. Okay, so let's move on with this lesson then. And we start off in 1978 in Afghanistan. And we end up with a political party called the PDPA, and they were a communist party. They actually took over Afghanistan. They got rid of the government, which was seen as cruel and oppressive, and they took control of the country. With this chap here, you can see in the picture, Nur Mohammad Taraki becoming the Prime Minister. Now, the Soviet leader at the time, Brezhnev, he backed this revolution, and he backed the government, and he backed Taraki as the leader. And Brezhnev said they would give the communists military equipment, and they would give them advisors. But this is a key part here. They wouldn't actually send soldiers into Afghanistan to support this government. And this scheme was known as the Soviet Military Assistance Program. And so, this communist government started to make a wide range of changes to Afghanistan. And it made reforms or law changes to things like lands and to things like marriage. Now, these were drastic changes to these traditional Afghanistan Muslims. And they had lived in Afghanistan for centuries. And these were deeply religious people who felt that their rights were being put under pressure, questioned by this new government. And that the government was going too far. The government was going against their traditional Islamic religious beliefs. And it didn't help that this government was really cruel to thousands of key religious people in Afghanistan as well. Lots of people were either imprisoned, or they were tortured, or they were killed. And looking at it from the Afghanistan point of view, this new government has come in, this new atheist government has come in, and it's forced changes they didn't want, and it started to target key religious individuals. And so you can imagine how upset the majority of the population of Afghanistan would be. So in September 1979, Taraki had been in charge for just over a year. Well, he was actually overthrown and he was killed by his vice president, Hafizullah Amin. Now, Amin felt that he could solve the instability. Amin felt he could get people on his side. But actually, what he did was he made things worse. Amin kept the communist land and marriage reforms, and he continued to upset many of the population who didn't want these changes to land. They didn't want these changes to marriage. They wanted things to be kept the way they'd been kept for centuries. And actually, well, Amin makes it even worse because Amin pushes things like equal women's rights, more equality for everyone. And this really upset, again, thousands of Afghanistan Muslims who wanted their traditional way of life returned. And these Afghanistan Muslims realised that the best way to do this was to get rid of the government. And so thousands of them joined what we call the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen were a freedom fighter group, and they said they were on a holy mission for Allah, that they were going to get rid of this atheist influence which had turned up in Afghanistan, and they were going to restore Afghanistan to the way it had been before. And that meant this war a jihad, or a holy war against the government. And they saw it was the only way to get rid of the government's changes. And they wanted Afghanistan to be an Islamic state that was run under strict Muslim laws. They didn't want these changes to be put in place. So, at this point, let's do a bit of work. So if you could look at task 1 for me, please, on your worksheet. And we've just looked at a range of new keywords and terminology that we might need to bring into a GCSE answer. Could I ask you to pause the video here, and can you complete the glossary boxes to make sure you're aware of what these words mean or who these people are, and to make sure you understand them before we move on. I've done the first one for you so you understand the sort of standard that I'm expecting here. If you're stuck, any of the slides with the blue background will help you. Once you've done that, press play again to continue. Okay, so let's look at what the USSR were thinking at this time. And Brezhnev, the leader pictured there, now clearly had a bit of a dilemma. Now, I said before, Brezhnev had been careful not to send troops into Afghanistan. Like we saw in the previous slides, he had sent equipment and advisors, but no actual soldiers. And that's because Brezhnev was really aware of the fact he didn't want to seem like the Soviets were invading Afghanistan. He'd support the Afghanistan Communist Party, but he wouldn't send his soldiers in. He wanted to try and keep this peace going. But now he was being told by the Communist Party, the PDPA, that actually they would lose this civil war against the Mujahideen unless the Red Army gave actual assistance. Advisors and equipment wasn't enough. The Communist Party in Afghanistan needed the Red Army to join them to fight the Mujahideen. Now, this was more complicated because of what had been going on nearby. And in 1979 in Iran, pictured there in yellow next to the green of Afghanistan, they got rid of their Shah, their leader, and there had been a Muslim fundamentalist uprising where the Muslims had got rid of their leader. And Brezhnev was terrified of this happening in Afghanistan as well. Because if it happened in Afghanistan, well, it could happen in other countries where Muslims were being subjected to communist rule. And they'd worked out that there were about 13 million Muslims within the Soviet Union. And Brezhnev didn't want these Muslims to start to get ideas of uprising. He wanted to make sure it was clear that the Red Army would take action to stop that. So, let's look at these next 2 points then. Just to recap, Brezhnev doesn't want Islamic fundamentalism to spread. With 30 million Muslims in the Soviet Union, Brezhnev doesn't want them to be encouraged by the actions in Iran and now Afghanistan to uprise for change. He had to send a clear message to Afghanistan. But also, Brezhnev doesn't trust Armin. Well, Armin had killed Taraki, who Brezhnev had said could be leader. And there were also concerns that Armin, the current Afghanistan communist leader, wasn't necessarily loyal to the Soviet Union. There were talks of him trying to negotiate with America and the CIA for aid. That meant getting rid of the unpopular Armin might also help calm the Afghans who were protesting at the time. So, that's the Russian point of view, but let's look at this from the American point of view as well. And you can see on this map, Afghanistan was key to America as well. And that's because America had a lot of oil in what we call the Persian Gulf region. You can see those oil fields there in places like Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And America relied on that oil to survive. And America basically, if they had no oil, they had no economy. They had no way of making money. It would shut the country down. Well, if those oil fields went, that would mean no economy. That would mean America wasn't a superpower anymore. And America were very much aware of the idea that if the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, they could use that as a stepping stone. Once the Red Army had crushed the rebels in Afghanistan, what was to stop them from going to Iran and taking over and spreading communism there, and then Iraq and Saudi Arabia? And actually, if they did that, America would lose control of the oil fields. So America felt that Russia and the Soviet Union were invading Afghanistan because they wanted to take control of oil fields and to win the Cold War this way. So, two complicated points of view there about why the Soviet Union would need to invade Afghanistan. Can you have a look at task 2 on your worksheet for me, please? I'm looking for 2 reasons why the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. I'd like one from a Soviet point of view. Can you think about the fact that they were stopping Islamic fundamentalism, that they were supporting an ally? And can you look at it from the American point of view as well, please? That they were seen as invading another country, they were using Afghanistan as a stepping stone, they were after the oil fields in the Persian Gulf region to try to cripple America. So 2 points of view. Once you're done, press play to continue. Again, if you need any information, you've got the red slides this time, which should help you answer this question. Okay, so let's look at the timeline of what happens next. Well, Christmas Eve, 24th of December 1979, the USSR sent troops into Afghanistan. And by the 27th of December 1979, Amin had been killed, and the Soviet Union had placed their own person in charge of the Afghanistan Communist Party, the PDPA. He was called Babrak Kemal. He's pictured there in colour. And this change prompted many Afghan soldiers to join the Mujahideen. They felt that the Soviet Union were now changing things too much, and so the Mujahideen numbers grew. Opposition to the Soviet Union grew. And Kemal realised he would need roughly 85,000 soldiers to keep him and the communist government in power. Now that meant he relied on the Soviet Union. There was no way he could have that many people himself. And that meant now that Russia was stuck fighting in Afghanistan. This was expensive in terms of money, with $8 billion a year to keep fighting. And it's expensive in terms of human life as well. About 15,000 Soviet troops died by the time Russia pulled out in 1989, and as many as 1.5 million civilian deaths as well from the Afghans, although that number's never been confirmed. Let's have a look at one more task here. Task 3. So we've got a statement here. We have been invited in by the Afghanistan government to protect it from some outside threats. We shall remove our forces as soon as the situation stabilises. That's a direct quote there from the hotline telephone conversation between Brezhnev and Carter on the 28th of December 1979. And here we've got Brezhnev explaining to President Carter why Soviet forces had entered Afghanistan. I want you to imagine you are President Jimmy Carter. What would you have done next in response to this invasion? What would your actions have been? Would you have acted upon this? Would you have sent your troops into Afghanistan to protect the oil fields? Would you have allowed this to happen? Try and keep détente going? Assume that they are telling the truth and they will leave Russia and then not after the oil fields at all? Have a think. And what would you have done? Write it down for me. Explain your actions and why you'd have done this in the paragraph. Okay, and that's pretty much it for this lesson. So it's the first of 2 lessons that you've got this week. I want to now look at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the consequences, because this would start the Second Cold War. So can you now, once you finish this worksheet, I'm looking for you to move on to the next video, please. We can look at the consequences and what happened next. Thank you, guys.